as we mentioned, there's a new kind of surprising standoff with China, which has just declared a new air defense zone, basically air defense rights over the Senkaku Islands. Some call it in the South China Sea, others say in the East China Sea. There you see them just east of Taiwan. This is a territorial dispute it's having with Japan as who has control over these, basically, as you can see there, pieces of rock. Senator Bai, how big an issue is this?
It's not that big right now, Chris, but in the future it's potentially very big. I agree with General Hayden. It's both dangerous and dumb. We used to have these encounters with the Soviets from time to time where aircraft would get too close to one another. We monitored one another. That can probably be handled, although it increases the chances of accidents. This is going to continue because you have an increasingly wealthy country spending more on its military, and I think the most important point, Chris, is they have intentionally stoked the forces of nationalism within China to divert people's attention away from other things that they may be unhappy about domestically. Nationalism, once unleashed, can go in any sort of unproductive directions. That really is the long-term danger. But it has had the somewhat helpful, from our point of view, consequence. It will drive the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, the Japanese into a much closer alliance with us. So it's a long-term problem, can probably be managed, but watch out for nationalism in China.
Britt, critics suggest that for all the Obama administration's talk these days about pivoting from the Middle East to a new focus on Asia, that what China sees is a president who desperately wants to stay out of all foreign entanglements, and therefore there's some weakness there, a vacuum that they want to fill.
That's the thing you worry about with a range of these administration moves, this president, unlike many of his predecessors, does not see the United States as necessarily the great bulwark in the world order, and that he prefers a more passive role, leading from behind, if you will, and that provides temptations for regimes like the Chinese, the Iranians, and others, and that they now have more freedom of movement because the President of the United States is indisposed to take tough measures. And that I think is kind of where we are, and that there is a unity among these differing issues in different places in the world, in that they test the resolve of the Obama administration, which these countries and their leaders suspect is not strong.
Speaking of testing the resolve of the Obama administration, we talked about Afghanistan, and Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, is refusing to sign a bilateral security agreement that had been worked out with the Obama administration. He says he's going to wait till after the elections next spring. He's also making new demands that we restart the peace talks with the Taliban, we release Afghan prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, and also real sharp limits on the ability of U.S. troops to go into any Afghan homes. There have obviously been some civilian deaths there. What do we do with Karzai, Congresswoman?
Well, there's an election next year which hopefully will be a fair election. The one in 2009 was not a fair election, the one in which there were ghost ballots and all kinds of other excesses, and unfortunately we did not intervene. This time, maybe, although he says he's living next door, we'll have a more independent president. I think on this BSA, Susan Rice has it right.
The security agreement.
Yes, it's been negotiated. It's approved by the Afghan Loya Jirga Constitutional or whatever Assembly, and it should not be renegotiated. I just want to make one other comment about the rebalance toward Asia. I think our position isn't leading from behind. I think our position is partnership with the nations of Asia, with whom we have strong trading and historic defense relationships, and supporting ASEAN and supporting these other groups, which the administration is doing, is the best buffer against China. Hopefully, over time, if TPP passes, the trade promotion agreement.
If I can just get back to Afghanistan for a moment, there was a very interesting article in the paper today, because at the same time, and this tells you something about Karzai, at the same time that he's condemning the U.S. for inadvertently killing some Afghan civilians in one of their villages, there was a terrible slaughter by the Taliban, and boo from President Karzai. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells us he's an uncertain trumpet because he has an uncertain constituency. And the fact is, we're now in the 13th year of the longest war in American history. And if he really forces the country, particularly Congress, to stand up and ratify staying there, particularly if our troops are A, minimal, and B, under rules of engagement that make their function either bad or dangerous, then he'll find out how ready we are to turn our back and leave.
Chris, you mentioned the show on Showtime. Karzai's behavior reminds me of one of my favorite movies, Blazing Saddles, where a character holds a gun to his own head and says, "Stop or I'll shoot." I mean, unless the man is suicidal, the future of his country is at stake here. He's going to have to give in. So we need to remain calm, make no concessions. This will work itself out. One final point. I think we're seeing some fallout from the decision to not do anything in Syria following the use of chemical weapons. We see that in Tehran with regard to their nuclear ambitions. We see that with regard to China being more assertive. Once Parliament voted not to use force, once it became clear the American people and Congress had no stomach for it, the rest of the world saw what the consequences of that would be, and their behavior